And it's very simple to state that nuclear danger is real and it's not in anybody's interest. And so let's do something about it. I think Trump, I don't say it's certain, but it's possible that he and Putin could come up with something. I just wish that more people in the Congress could say something, do something. I don't, so stimulating other people, whether it's the churches, the university presidents, or senators or Congress people, they ought to be talking about the nuclear danger and incorporating that into the larger settlement between the U.S. and Russia.
Welcome. I'm Katrina Vanden Heuvel. I'm editor and publisher of The Nation magazine, 160 years strong, and president of the American Committee for U.S.-Russia Accord. And today we're very pleased, very grateful to have the opportunity once again to team up with Pascal Otaz and host this gathering for Neutrality Studies. Thank you, Pascal. Mindful that the turmoil and tragedy in Ukraine long predates 3 years since the Russian invasion, which we marked on Monday, we nevertheless and quite suddenly seem only a month into Donald Trump's second term to be reaching a kind of endgame. Today, we plan to discuss this, of course, but also we feel it's important, as all of you on this call know, that talks have begun, but there are larger questions. The settling of the war is critical, but does not automatically solve all the other outstanding problems with the U.S.-Russia relationship, which is, after 3 years of no discussion between President Biden and Vladimir Putin, of no discussion, at least there's some diplomacy. And we believe that among the most critical of these outstanding problems are the vast stockpiles of nuclear weapons that ring the globe that each country possesses. The landmark strategic nuclear accord signed under Obama, all of you know this, New START, will expire 1 year from now, February 2026. This, we think, is among the most urgent of post-Ukraine war priorities for the administration. So we have much to get to. We have remarkable panelists, and I look forward to the conversation. Pascal, over to you.
Thank you very much, Katrina, and thank you very much to the American Committee for U.S.-Russia Accord, which you're heading for setting this up and reaching out. Hello, everybody. I am Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm honored to host this panel of outstanding personalities to discuss the very sad third anniversary of large-scale violence in Ukraine. Much about this is still hotly contested, starting from the name itself. Is it a war? Is it a special military operation? And when exactly did it start? Did it begin, with the transgression of Russian troops into Ukrainian territory on February 24th, 2022? Or did it go back to the fateful days of 2014 when the democratically elected government of Viktor Yanukovych was overthrown and an armed rebellion started in the Donbass and militia forces appeared in Crimea? Or does it even go further back to the 1990s and the several rounds of NATO expansion? Many of these questions and viewpoints remain to be settled and agreed upon. Here with me to discuss this are three wonderful guests. I've got with me Governor Jerry Brown, Governor Jerry Brown, who was the 34th and 39th governor of the state of California. We are also joined by William D. Hartung, a fellow at the Quincy Institute and the previous director at the Arms and Security Program at the Center for International Policy. We've got Cynthia Lazarov with us, a documentary filmmaker and founder of US-Russian Exchange Initiatives and Nuclear Wake-Up Call.Earth. And, of course, last but not least, Katrina Vanden Heuvel, the president of the American Committee of US-Russia Accord and the former editor-in-chief of The Nation magazine. Everybody, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pascal.
Well, maybe to the three panelists, and maybe let's start with Governor Brown, but I will also ask Cynthia and Bill to give your views on this. Over the last 3 years, the last 3 sad years, what do you think is most important that we have learned about the conflict that is going on? And please feel free to focus on micro subject or on the macro picture as you think? What's the learning outcome of the last 3 years, Governor Brown?
I would say it reaffirms the notion of the fog of war, that
Mhm.
you never know what you're getting into when you embark upon the serious matter of taking over another country. We know from history that many moves have been made. They can look good on paper. Sometimes they can look good for many months, but they often turn sour. So I'd say prudence and restraint is very much implicated where we are. The tragedy is there. So Putin, I think, was surprised. Obviously, he was surprised. Also, the valor and the ingenuity of the Ukrainian people and the leadership of Zelensky and others, their military people, their citizens, they rallied and they repelled the Russian invasion, which probably, without knowing all the details, reflects an arrogance of power, the arrogance that they thought with the number of troops, they could just take over Ukraine. Perhaps Putin also thought that the Ukrainians would welcome them, or at least enough of them to make the operation that he launched much easier than it turned out to be. So I'd say the determination of the Ukrainian people in holding back the Russians and advancing, and then now holding back the Russians as they make a slow advance. The suffering, the acceptance of hundreds of thousands of deaths and injuries. This is monumental. And the lesson to me, of course, is the folly of humankind. How do we get into these things? How could Putin ever do this? And of course, when the history, so Putin has his flaws and I'd say real culpability here. But over the last 10 years, 20 years, a lot of things were done by Europe, by the other countries in Europe, and by American presidents that did not build the kind of understanding and respect that might have prevented this war. I certainly think this war was not in the mind of Putin 20 years ago. And so a lot of things happened. And I'd say there's a lot of blame to go around. I don't want to compare culpabilities because Putin launched the war. He started killing people. That's of a certain magnitude. Now, all that speculation is for historians and perhaps moralists. What is for now? What is at stake is how do you get out of it? What are the moves that can bring this war to a close, to make the relations in Eastern Europe more stable, give people a sense of security, and finding a way for the West, for the countries in Europe and the United States to work with Putin and Russia. A very different character. I'd say has very different flaws than Americans have. A lot of flaws to go around, I would say, blind spots. So, yes, there's a lot to be done. I'd say the most important thing now is to work out ways to stop the war and then going forward to constitute, if at all possible, a different kind of relationship. That's the way I see it. I think it's possible, no matter what your judgment of Putin is, whatever his many character flaws are. He still was someone that was working with the West not too many years ago. And remember, the U.S. worked very closely with Stalin. Nixon could drink champagne with Mao Zedong. So I wouldn't focus on Putin, the personality. I'd focus on the suffering and the pathways forward to reduce the evil, the conflict, the war, and get more stability and understanding in that part of Europe.
The interesting thing is that some of my viewers of this channel, they will argue that a lot of the blame is to search for in Europe and the US for the escalation that happened before. But the interesting thing is it doesn't even matter which one it is that we subscribe to, because the genesis, what matters is now if whether or not with these different interpretations of what happened, we will come to converge into a spiral that is virtuous and brings us to de-escalation or not. But Cynthia, may I ask you about your primary insight? And if you want to react to anything you've heard, please feel free to do so.
Thank you, Pascal. I appreciated the governor's overview and looking at the different points of sides in all of this, and really the kind of broad look at what's happened. I'm in the place where we have looking at the staggering human costs of this war, which the governor referenced, with over 1 million dead or wounded, and ongoing escalatory risks. If you look at the 14.6 million people in need of humanitarian aid, 3.7 million internally displaced in the country, 6.8 million seeking refugees outside the country, and then the millions of families separated by the war, and including children taken without a parent to Russia. And a survey conducted by the International Rescue Committee found that 74% of its clients had been forcibly separated from a close family member. So then, these are just some of the staggering costs for people. And so for me, the call, President Trump's call for a ceasefire and jumpstarting negotiations now to end the war are significant positive steps and long overdue, to really stop the suffering and the killing and to bring this conflict to an end. I think one of the challenges is that if you look, and when I speak to my Ukrainian friends, they remind me that the conflict started in 2014. Now, people might have a different point of view within Ukraine, but when I hear about this, it's the conflict started in 2014. The war, that was the first phase of the war, and February 2022 was the second phase of the war. But I think one of the challenges is if you go back to 2014, every ceasefire in Ukraine since 2014 has failed. And those ceasefires have failed for many reasons. The Minsk Accords that put them in place, the Minsk agreements, were deeply flawed. But one of the main reasons they failed was lack of political will on multiple levels. In the West, the narrative is that the Ukraine war is a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. This is certainly one level of the conflict, the obvious level, but there are other two levels that are the American-led geopolitical conflict between the US and NATO and its allies, which is now shifting, and then also the civil war dimension of the conflict within Ukraine itself, which is deeply divided between East and West. So in my conversations with Ukrainian civil society representatives, they tell me that an enduring peace can only be achieved by addressing all three levels of the conflict, including the third level, which is maintaining the peace within Ukraine itself. And they see an inclusive, human-centered peace process with the meaningful participation of civil society and women from across Ukraine, representing a wide spectrum of views, where they can voice their needs and interests, especially those stakeholders most impacted by the conflict, and have these addressed in a peace agreement. They see these as imperatives for building the trust and securing the political will necessary for a ceasefire to hold and ultimately for a sustainable peace in Ukraine. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And I think these three levels are very important to keep in mind. And also, I had discussion with a Russian colleague the other day, and he pointed out the most important thing to them, to Moscow at the moment, is a comprehensive security agreement that stabilizes that not just transforms the war into peace, but also transforms the instability in Europe into a environment in which everybody can thrive. But let me hand it over to William. Bill, what's your learning outcome? And again, you feel free to react as well.
Well, I concur with Governor Brown's analysis and Cynthia's point that it's got to be broad-based participation in any peace agreement. That's the only way it's going to hold and really meet the needs of people of Ukraine. One thing I saw from the war is just miscalculation on all sides. Russia thought it was going to roll in and conquer Ukraine. Some of the supporters of Ukraine's defense, which of course had to be supported, I think were unrealistic in thinking that Ukraine could militarily drive Russia out of the country. And so I think that prolonged the war. The U.S. did a lot of things that created tension leading up to the war, NATO expansion and so forth. But I would agree, Putin pulled the trigger on this particular invasion as he bears the bulk of responsibility. But I also think all the way back, at the breakup of the Soviet Union, that was a major missed opportunity because Russia was not really embraced politically by Europe. Some of the economic measures put by the West brought the Russian economy to its knees. I think that situation made it easier for a strongman sort of nationalist like Putin to rise to power in the first place. So that's not responsible for a war, but it's an example of how diplomatic errors can have implications for decades after they're made. And then there's the environment in Washington where it was kind of a Cold War atmosphere where even mentioning the word diplomacy was viewed as being pro-Putin, even if it was the understanding that, yes, give Ukraine the wherewithal to defend itself, but have a diplomatic track, have some communications, because you're never going to have peace if the two sides aren't even talking to each other. So, and also I think it was spun in a certain way, like the U.S. support for Ukraine was kind of expanded to, well, the U.S. is the arsenal of democracy. It's a fight of democracies versus autocracies. I think would be a big surprise to people in Gaza or Yemen or all the other places where the U.S. has funded repressive, undemocratic regimes. So it gave a certain gloss to U.S. policy that got in the way of talking about a more humane, more sensible foreign policy for the United States. So in that sense, although it was important to defend Ukraine, the way it was spun in Washington, I think, was a setback for building a sensible U.S. foreign policy. And even the arms industry got into the mix. Well, if we're going to do this, you need to give us more money, more factories, fewer regulations. They sort of put their whole agenda that they had been pushing for decades and hooked it to Ukraine in a way that was completely opportunistic, had nothing to do with defending the people of Ukraine. So there were a lot of factors, and also the kind of human costs that Cynthia talked about are not front and center in the media discussions of any of this, and I think that's hugely unfortunate.
Thank you for this overview. Question, Katarina, do you also want to add something, or are you going to stay out?
I'm going to stay out, I think.
Okay, then let me maybe ask a follow-up, which is the importance of how we understand what actually happened. Because on one way to see what Russia's objective was in 2022 is that he wanted to invade Ukraine and take it all over and swallow it whole. That's one interpretation. The other, and he failed at that, right? The other interpretation is he wanted to scare Ukraine into making an agreement that for which they started negotiations immediately, right? And that was done partially in Minsk, partially online, and then the final rounds were done in Istanbul. And then those agreements fell apart in early April 2022. For whoever is to blame for that. But under this interpretation, this was the military intervention was a strategy in order to create a diplomatic outcome that was wanted. How do you, Governor Brown, how do you think these two different narratives about what happened impact the way that now the United States is going to approach the next phase or the next years of the conflict?
Well, I'm not sure. You've laid out two interpretations. Given Putin's 5,000-word essay attempting to show or to prove that Ukraine has always been part of Russia and it's not a country. So I don't know why he'd want to just stimulate diplomatic talk when he doesn't even think it was a country. But who knows what's in Putin's mind? Who knows what's in Trump's mind? We don't know all that. So the fact is, you got a lot of people suffering. You've got a lot of hatred, very justifiable in the minds of all these people. And getting over that is going to be really difficult, just given what happened. So it's going to be a negotiation. I can't imagine how that's going to go. And is he going to be reasonable in the minds that will be accepted by the Europeans? Or what will America want? I don't know. I don't think it's that easy. I can't really tell you. I mean, I think there's so many ways to interpret what's happened in the last 30 years vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine. And so you can write books on that. I think right now we do have to understand the reality on the ground. And I can say from what I've learned about Ukraine, I've only been there once. I've talked to the defense minister. I've talked to the former president. I don't feel I know anything about it. There's just too much history. So on that, I think U.S. and Putin and Ukraine and Europe, they're all going to have to at some point get into the mix. Just some kind of a diktat coming from Putin, Trump. I don't know how far that's going to go. So we got a real mess here. Trump may be able to do whatever he wants, and that can open doors. The trouble is he prevaricates so much. How in the world can there be a deal? What can Putin ever trust? How can the Americans ever trust Trump? And how can the Europeans or the Ukrainians trust anybody? So trust is an irreducible ingredient in a truce, a negotiation, coexistence. And trust has been destroyed very profoundly. So I can't tell you. I mean, you got to get in that discussion, start talking to Putin, and what are you going to do about this? And then from Putin's point of view, he's got a lot of grievances, from the NATO bombing of Serbia to the getting rid of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. We have all these issues that were not in detail, but in spirit, prophesied by George Kennan, by McNamara, even by Pipes. And all these experts said, this is a terrible idea, advancing NATO. Well, we did. So it's a mess that has a lot of residue where we are. So I would just say, get going, Trump, Putin, start talking. But those two aren't going to end this war. It's going to take the involvement of Ukraine, and it's going to take the involvement of Europe, and they got to come out with something that's fair. And how do you get something fair in this cauldron of killing, torture, and hatred? Boy, I would just say, that's why I want to concentrate. Come up with some ideas, come up with a way to stop the fighting and get some stability going forward. But boy, the grievances are so deep, and Putin has his own grievances. You may say they're completely unjustified, but that's really irrelevant. Whatever Putin thinks, that's what he thinks. And since he's got the country behind him, or he's got it under his control, we got to deal with that. So one way or the other, Putin is Putin, and Ukraine is Ukraine, and how we put all those together, that is, I think, deeply challenging. But we've got to focus on those ingredients. What are the pieces that will allow this war to come to an end now, not years from now?
This is a very good observation, especially about the issue of trust. And trust is not just something abstract. It is an ingredient in order to come to resolutions. And we've had a track record of both sides, or all sides will claim that the other one has a track record of breaking that trust, right? That's the inherent dynamic of a conflict. Cynthia, do you think that there are practical steps that are being taken right now, or that should be taken in order to come back to a process that will build not just trust, but a productive outcome toward peace and stability?
Thank you, Pascal. That's a really good question. I want to touch on a couple of things that I think, just to break down sort of what I think are the basic elements of what needs to happen for there to address the different layers of the conflict that I mentioned earlier. So one is that Ukraine clearly has to have hard security guarantees for it to be satisfied, for its security interest to be addressed. Russia, and there needs to be talk about a wider security architecture for Europe and beyond. And I think that Russia and the US and Europe need to be in those discussions. I think that there's the level of stopping the killing, the ceasefire that I talked about before. And I think that the hatred and the pain and the grievances that Governor Brown so eloquently referenced are really smoldering there, and they're going to be really hard to heal. They're in the Colombian negotiations in the peace process. One of the processes that they used was a forum, a commission of victims dialogues where victims could come from all sides and air their grievances. And that was a way on the ground, and a human-centered way to begin to provide a forum for those to be voiced and to begin the healing process. So it's got to be multi-tracked, multi-leveled. I think that there can be, on the level of sort of steps to be taken in a phased agreement, I think that you can have confidence-building measures that are going to build trust that the ceasefire is going to hold, or trust that people can trust this agreement. And again, it's going to be hard, but things can be done, like beginning to stop all attacks on civilian and energy infrastructure, for example, as a way to start a phase in a ceasefire. Stop other confidence-building measures like opening humanitarian corridors for aid where it's not readily available at this point. There are different things like that can be done to begin to create that process on the ground. But I think there can be these kinds of reconciliation dialogues that were taking place between 2014 and 2022. But in 2022, you couldn't do that anymore inside Ukraine, because to actually be against the war became dangerous. To actually be for peace, for reconciliation, became something that was not you weren't able to do that. So I think that I think there are levels. There's sort of the human level of those kinds of things, but then there's also thinking through how to facilitate the reunification of families. Many Ukrainians have Russian relatives, and many who are in Russia, and many have others who Russians have Ukrainian relatives in Ukraine, and who are separated for one reason or another. Those families coming back together in some way and having the freedom to travel back and forth to see each other, those families can be perhaps a way to bring wider healing. They can be a force for healing. That's also in the conversation. So I think there are many things that can be done, but I think there's the sort of high level, the level from the top. And as Governor Brown said, it's not going to just come. They can't just make it from the top and have it happen. It's got to come up from the ground as well. So there are models for multi-track processes where there are different tracks addressing different things all at the same time, like the Helsinki Accords, for example, had a basket approach that was simultaneous. So all of that has to be thought through very carefully in the ceasefire design and in the peace process design, and it's got to be inclusive.
Yes.
So I want to inject there. I think the feelings, the hatred, the sense of injustice the demand for revenge, it's very powerful. And I think it's going to take some very astute thinking to figure out how to proceed. I don't know. I mean, who knows? With Trump as the man for America and Putin, it's going to take something. I think just if you had a bunch of a group of victims, Russians and Ukrainians, put them in the same room, I wouldn't want to be close to that. So this is going to take sequential steps, and a lot of it will depend on what Putin is willing to do. And I think the gap between what Putin is seeing and what Putin wants, and what the Europeans and what America and Ukraine has wanted, are so divergent that I don't know. I'm sure other people can figure it out. But look, there's got to be a way to stop the fighting, and stop the fighting. You need more greater agreement to create some stability. But there's got to be a sense of justice, and how you create that, I can't tell you. But I just want to signal that it's going to be really difficult.
But we are at the point where all parties are saying that they want an end to the fighting. That would be a goal, actually, also from the Russian side, which has been saying for a while that they're open for negotiations, and now we have negotiations, but we also have a situation in which the Americans and the Russians are saying we want to negotiate about more than just Ukraine. We also want to negotiate about trade relations between us. So in a sense, we are now at an even broader framework. But let me bring in Bill. What's your reactions to this? And do you think that the most conductive way to an agreement is top-down meeting between Trump and Putin, or bottom-up, as Cynthia also emphasized, with trying to have grassroots understanding between the parties again?
Well, I think if this phase of Russia and the US is brief, just to kind of lay out the two sides, that's fine. But it's got to include the Europeans, Ukraine, the people of Ukraine, if it's going to be a stable peace agreement. I also think all sides have to feel like they're more secure ending the war than continuing it. And, in the West, I think some of Russia's concerns have been dismissed. But if that's what they believe, if that's what they think is important to them, it has to be accommodated in some way. And I think, probably the security guarantees for Ukraine may be the hardest. I mean, if it's not membership in NATO, what is it? And how does it come into play? And does it make the people of Ukraine feel sufficiently safe? So, but yeah, I think ultimately you have to bring a lot more parties into it. It can't just be, Putin and Trump over the heads of everybody else. So I'm hoping that's just a short feeling out period, and it broadens.
One of the things that I emphasize usually is that the best security guarantee you can get is if you have no enemies. If nobody wants to invade you, then you're really safe. There's this tiny little country called Liechtenstein, right sandwiched between Switzerland and Austria. Neither of the two ever attacked it. It would make no sense. So, do you think that we might get to a point where we think security bigger again, outside the framework of who has what kind of guns and weapons, and who points them at whom under what kind of circumstances, where security would mean again, not just being secure from each other, but being secure together. Governor Brown, how do you see the perception of America about what security means? Well, maybe in the European context, but in general.
Well, I think most Americans find the war very remote and probably aren't giving it much thought. What strikes me as I listen, I go back in my mind to when Clinton was working with Yeltsin and then Putin. They were talking about a Russian involvement, even in NATO. There was some kind of a partnership that they were looking at, and Clinton gave the Russians a voice, but not a veto. And it turns out that was a pretty weak voice that was being extended. So if then, where the relations were much better, and wasn't any of this horrible negativity, they couldn't even get together. And now you're raising the point of how can there be some modus vivendi among Russia and the West and Ukraine. It's got to be much harder. Now, having said that, as Bill said, all this suffering, all these killings, people want to stop. So that's the big motivator. The horror is heavy enough that that could push people to compromise and to accept things that would be unthinkable a year ago or even 6 months ago. So what are those things? And it's going to take it's going to take some reasonableness on Putin's part. It's going to take a lot on the part of the Ukrainians, and then it's going to take a lot on the so-called deal maker. Does Trump have the wherewithal, the patience, the intelligence, the capability? He says he's a great deal maker. Well, this kind of a deal looks extremely formidable, to say the least. And there it is. So I'm not giving you a very good answer. I really want to signal I'm pretty skeptical. I'm hopeful because Trump is shuffling the deck. I don't think we were in a good place before Trump. And so even though things look pretty bad the first month, maybe through all this chaos, there might be a way forward just because people don't want it to get worse.
That's a strong motivator. Cynthia, do you want to react to this or to my question of how to create a common understanding of security?
Well, I think that when you ask me that question, and I think about Gorbachev's vision for a collective security agreement at the end of the Cold War, from Lisbon to Vladivostok was the call. And I think that's obviously a missed opportunity, that when the Warsaw Pact was disbanded, there was, the question was, well, why do we need NATO? Because we no longer have the Warsaw Pact. Why don't we have one common collective security agreement? So I think that collective security architecture is where we need to go, and it's a redefinition of what security is. I also think that the realities on the ground, the difficulties, the challenges that have been referenced in this conversation are formidable. And I also think we have to have that vision. And really even a bigger vision in terms of what human security is. There's military security, and then there's human security. And then the times that we're living in demand that we come together to address other existential threats like climate change. And so we have to have a different understanding of what security is, and come together and get beyond the military confrontations to address the common enemies that we have. So part of it is understanding the sort of common challenges that we have and making those like the existential threats we face.
Thank
Well,
you.
I think, well, I don't really know. I have a lot of uncertainty here, but I do think instead of trying to create the beautiful world which we all aspire to, but there are moves. Russia can pull back troops, NATO can do certain things, and these arms negotiators get very technical and have different small steps that begin and proceed. So maybe there is something in the traditional way of working out some kind of mutual arrangement. I don't rule that out. It's just that Putin wants this war, and the U.S. wants to keep Russia at bay, and now they have far less reason to trust. So there's a lot to overcome, and that would suggest they have to make minimal but significant steps. And yes, have a big dream of a new relationship, Russia and the West, but I think you got to take small steps, and that's going to be more aspirational than something written on the page of paper.
Bill, I would like to bring you in. Can you react to this?
Well, I think, yeah, in the short term, small steps, confidence building measures, but I think eventually it has to be embedded in a larger European security architecture where there's incentives for countries to have normal relations. And certainly the record of military force in this century has been dreadful. Nobody's won any of these wars. There's just been, who suffered more, who paid a higher price. But that doesn't seem to have fully penetrated the public mind in Washington or around the country, because there's still these talks of peace through strength, and kind of putting your chips on a military solution, when it's been absolutely bankrupt in his approach to even military problems, much less the fact it does nothing about climate change, pandemics, things that ultimately may be bigger threats to us. It's put nuclear arms control and reductions on hold. So I think somehow you need short-term measures, but we have to get further than just kind of an armed standoff. I mean, we really, at this moment in history, given, for example, what's coming out of Washington, where they're essentially trying to dismantle democracy, I think you need a larger vision and you need the immediate defense, because if people are going to put their lives on the line or take risks they would normally take, it's got to be for a bigger vision, a different kind of world. Otherwise, I think it's kind of this back and forth between, moments of calm and moments of war, and you never really get past that. So I would not want us to lower our ambitions for the kind of world we want to see, but I understand there's a lot of immediate business to be taken care of. But I think there could be a way to make small steps to deal with the immediate, sort of stop the bleeding, stop the killing, but not to stop there, to try to build a bigger kind of context where war is less likely, and people take in the reality that should have already sunk in, that war is often a disaster for all concerned. More importantly, we don't have the resources to be putting our minds, our planning, our money on fighting wars when there's so many other threats to humanity that have nothing to do with how many missiles, how many aircraft carriers you have, and so forth. So, it's a change of mindset is necessary. But I think if there's a vision of where we want to go, it'll be easier to bring about that change.
Yeah, I see that. I see that too. The point is that with the new administration, actually, there is a change of hearts, right? The difference that in signaling, in like speech acts, and in the ways that Washington also now behaves and works towards Russia and towards Europe have changed dramatically since January, right? But this also brings us to one of the main issues of how this conflict and international relations work, which is that the United States has a political process which is very hard to predict for Americans and for everybody abroad. Policy can change on a 4-year cycle. On the other hand, there are policy thinkers like yourselves, like people in different think tanks who have very divergent strategic visions. What do you think, Governor Brown, are the most essential factors that shape long-term US policy strategy, if we can say so? Like, what is it that makes the US do what it does on the world stage?
Well, that's quite a question. What makes America do what it does? I don't know that we ever know not only what makes America do what it does, or even what any of us individually do. I think motives are for Freudian analysts. Who the hell knows what makes people do what? But I would say, because if you just look at what's going on right now, a $4 trillion tax cut, when we have trillions of dollars of climate mitigation absolutely going to become due, and adaptation, responding to the built-in climate disruptions, that's trillions, and we're just squandering our resource base. So there's a lot of I can't tell you what America, I think, likes being the indispensable power, likes being those comments by Madeleine Albright and by others about being indispensable. By Hillary Clinton talked about indispensable. That idea that we're the anchor, the guardian of a peaceful world, that's very strong, and that leads to a lot of overreach, and so that needs to be taken down. And perhaps Trump is doing that. I would say Trump has expressed some aversion to nuclear weapons. So if we're talking about a larger issue, as they work out these fine details on a ceasefire and then following the Russia, Ukraine, West-East kind of thing, a big topic is what are we doing about these nuclear weapons and the buildup and the 5 weapon systems of Putin and the weapons buildup by the United States and modernization. And now the bipartisan committee calling for even more nuclear buildup and military buildup. And then you've got China there trying to catch up a little bit, not really to our level, but to get at least to double what they got. So I think nuclear, there's a lot of room there because it's so excessive, so absurd, so stupid that they ought to acknowledge the danger, the stupidity of threatening one another with mutual annihilation and bring that into it. I think maybe Trump, he's not going to work on climate. That doesn't exist. That's a big issue to work on. He's not working on bio threats, which is another big issue, both natural and engineered pathogens. That's another big issue. Okay, but nuclear is something he has expressed concern about. So maybe that's an area where they could new start, come up with alternatives. That's something important. That's really, it makes no sense. And since we were going to talk about nuclear, I kind of geared up for that. I'm struck by this idea. Why haven't we had a nuclear war, a nuclear exchange? And the answer is nobody knows. Luck. It's McNamara said luck. Kennedy said, I think he said it was we had a 30% chance of going to nuclear exchange. So we got this monster, this huge thing hanging over us. Can Trump maybe grasp that? I think he might. And then you got to talk to Putin. He doesn't seem to be worried about his nuclear weapons. They all think they're little toys that they can control with a few presses of the button, a few commands. But the truth is, there's an instability in the security of the nuclear arsenals on all sides. As Bill Perry talked about, the risk of a blunder, a mistake, an accident. And Sam Nunn has worked a long time and finally got what he calls fail-safe review, which is now going on. What's a fail-safe review? It's to find out what in your system is going to go wrong and can start the whole Armageddon by accident. And so they want to find out where are those flaws, which indicates they think there probably are some flaws. So maybe that's something that Putin and Trump can talk about. So there is a big encompassing issue besides these more limited matters in Ukraine and Donbass and Russia. So yeah, talk about these technical things in small steps for a truce, but get into the nuclear field. Do something about that, because that is the ultimate wipeout. And I think Trump gets that, and Putin should get it. And so they should be able to come to some agreement, and that would build a lot of confidence if they started reducing nuclear weapons.
You're absolutely right about that. And the good news is that the Russians have repeatedly and time and again said a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And one of the steps that could happen is if the United States changed its nuclear doctrine to no first strikes. Cynthia, do you believe that this is realistic, that the US might at one point say, like, okay, we will write it into our doctrine that we will never ever use these weapons first, which is something that the Russians used to have in their doctrine and then changed. But in order to get back to this point, because it's absolutely right, the greatest danger to humanity is humanity itself, because we now have the weapons to end it all. How do you see it?
Well, I'm really glad that we've moved to the nuclear issue, because that's also what I've been thinking a lot about in the context of the shift in relations. So and as far as no first use goes, it's absolutely clear that if the US and Russia were to agree to no first use, it would immediately reduce the risk of nuclear war. And so, but it's been very hard to get the US to agree to do this, and Russia did have it. China does have it now. China has declared no first use. One of the reasons that the US has said that they haven't, well, so for example, Biden ran on a campaign platform that he was going to try to do no first use, but once he got into office, nothing happened. That's happened before. And so the sort of argument I hear from people, in the Pentagon is that it would impact our relationship with our allies if they wouldn't be able to trust that we would be there for them if, we declare no first use if they needed us, kind of thing. I mean, that's just one of the arguments that I've heard against it. I think it would be a very important confidence building measure for the larger relationship and the nuclear security architecture that is so in need of help right now. But I also want to just say that I think that just the fact that after 3 years of not talking, the two presidents, that to see the presidents of the United States and Russia now talking, the two countries that possess over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons, finally in a dialogue again is a huge step in the right direction, just in terms of, because one of my biggest concerns over the last few years has been the lack of dialogue and diplomacy, that it broke down after Russia's full-scale invasion. And this, there's a basic principle of nuclear risk reduction that you never stop talking to your nuclear adversary, no matter what, because nuclear risk never goes away. And in fact, the opposite is true in a time of war, when the risk of escalation to a nuclear exchange due to blunder, accident, miscalculation, mistake, or false alarm is elevated due to the fog of war. So without good communication channels in place, this increases the likelihood of escalation to nuclear use in a moment of crisis. And talking is what saved us during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I want to say that I think that step of actually having it being in the conversation is really important. And I have some things to say about New START, but maybe we want to hear from Bill before I talk about New START, because there's some things specifically there. What do you think?
Yeah, let's go into New
Either
START
way,
in a
yeah.
moment, Bill. But Bill, please.
Well, I think going back to why does the United States do what it does? I think coming out of World War II, there were a lot of kind of classic features of an imperial power. You could tie some of the interventions to very specific economic interest. The coup in Iran when they were nationalizing oil, or the coup in Guatemala when they were taking over land from U.S. corporations, or even as late as the overthrow of Allende, there was sort of kind of a rational imperialism, not morally justifiable, but there seemed to be goals, there seemed to be end results. I think now it's irrational, even from the point of view of economics, to destroy countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. No real benefit. And the cost of the post 9/11 wars were $8 trillion to the United States. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died around the world, hundreds of thousands of veterans with psychological and physical wounds. It really didn't accomplish anything, even if your goal is global dominance. So I think there's an irrational element now, and especially at the nuclear level, it's sort of like a mutual death pact. I mean, it's understood that if significant numbers of these things are used, there'll be huge numbers of deaths immediately. There'll be deaths from radiation. It could undermine global agriculture. There could be a nuclear winter. So knowing all of that, how can you step back and say, well, let's have this chessboard of how many of this type and how many of that type and escalation, when the whole proposition is putting life as we know it at risk? And so even if you're the greediest person imaginable, if life ends, your life ends too. I mean, it's sort of like it's just, to me, that at the level of the elites, there's no rationality in the bigger scale of things.
Bill, I want to inject you. What you're saying is absolutely true. This whole nuclear business is insane. I mean, the idea America's gonna use nuclear weapons first against a nuclear power when they have conventional weaponry, and maybe get a nuclear attack on the mainland. It's suicide. It's cuckoo. And so no first use should be a no-brainer. No one's gonna. There's no rationality to go first. However, Obama, who got a Nobel Prize on this topic, he didn't want to. He backed off. He had people he picked for his nuclear posture statement didn't want to have no first use, so that didn't happen. Then Biden, he's going to have no first use, and the lady a woman who was working for the Defense Department who was pushing it, he fired because people in Congress said, "Oh, this lady's going to be for no first use. Let's get her out of there. We don't want her messing with the nuclear posture review." So Biden and Obama both prove no first use has no chance whatsoever in that regime. Now, can we get it as part of a Putin-Trump deal? Possibly. But there's something real crazy here because, well, it makes no sense. But also, launch on warning makes no sense. In fact, if you want to go there, the ICBMs in the minds of a lot of people don't make a lot of sense. So we are mired in irrationality. And if this discussion with Ukraine engaging Putin and Trump, maybe they'll be able to talk turkey about something. And this guy Trump likes practical deals. It's not inconceivable because what we were doing before under our fine presidents, Biden and Obama. Well, Obama got a new start, but he went for modernization as the payment. So Trump may be bad, but it wasn't good before. So maybe there's an opening here. Maybe the craziness of this current administration may break new ground. I'm hoping. That's kind of hope in the dark.
Let me just ask for a second before we go into New Start. Like, even if Trump and Mr. Putin came to an agreement and signed a treaty that would include no first use, that would have to go through Congress, right? And Congress would actually have to sign off on no first use and the treaty as well. I mean, in general, in order to ratify it. Maybe, Bill, you want to say something about that, but can someone answer to me at least what Mr. Trump needs to keep in mind? He doesn't rule alone. Congress is there.
Oh, yes, he does. The MAGA have to do whatever he says. That's the beauty of Trump. If he agrees, all the Republicans will vote as robots until they don't. But
so that would be a chance for actually getting the policy through.
Exactly. If it may never happen, but if it can happen, Trump can get his MAGA boys to vote yes.
Bill?
Yeah, I think there's this dysfunctional politics of nuclear weapons. Even going back to the so-called nuclear triad, part of the reason it exists is because both the Navy and the Air Force wanted a piece of that budget. It wasn't a carefully thought out strategy. And you've got 4 states, small states, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, Utah, whose senators have formed an ICBM coalition to prevent they've gotten a law that says you cannot reduce ICBMs below current levels. So, their combination with the contractors has stood in the way of rational policy. And there was even a congressional commission on strategic posture, which unbelievably said this current $2 trillion buildup over 30 years was not enough. And the co-chair of that commission, John Kyle, was one of the most adamant enemies of arms control when he was in the Senate, was a lobbyist for Northrop Grumman, the biggest nuclear weapons producer in the United States. And, you would think when they brought this to Congress, there'd be some questions about, is the buildup making us safer? What's the state of, the nuclear posture around the world? Is this the right way to go? What does it cost? No, the members mostly talked about, well, there's this great missile in my state, and shouldn't we build more? And so there's this completely shameless kind of narrow view of this. Only Senator Warren, interrupted it to say, isn't this going to, accelerate the arms race? And by the way, what's it going to cost? And the heads of the commission said, oh, it's too important to worry about cost. So not only was there no discussion of whether this made sense strategically, but it was all about the money. And in the context of the problems we face, the size of the U.S. and world economy, it's not a lot of money. It's wired politically in a way that gets in the way of sensible nuclear policy.
Cynthia, maybe this is the point to bring in New Start. Could you maybe briefly also give us the history of New Start, just for people who are not familiar with it, and then tell us what's important about it at the moment?
Well, New Start came into place under Obama, as Governor Brown said. It's the only remaining arms control treaty that puts a cap on our nuclear arsenals. As Katrina mentioned early on, it's set to expire a year from now in February 2026. It puts a cap on deployed nuclear weapons for US and Russia at 1550 on both sides. So that's sort of the context for the treaty. So ideally, New START would be extended, or at least the US and Russia would agree to abide by its terms while a new arms control agreement is negotiated to replace it. And until recently, that was thought to be nearly impossible given the state of relations. But following the Trump-Putin phone call and Trump's announcement that he wants to enter denuclearization talks with both Russia and China, Putin has now said that the US and Russia will have to address the extension of New START. This is a huge shift on Russia's part, and a sign that we have a chance to either extend it or at least abide by its terms when it expires, after it expires next year, while a new arms control agreement is negotiated. But I want to touch on this idea of denuclearization talks with Russia and China and just talk about a challenge here that I see based on what we've seen in the past. So in 2020, Trump refused to extend New START. He was concerned about China's nuclear arsenal back then and called for three-way talks at that time. He wanted China to start reducing their arsenals along with the US and Russia and make it a three-way thing. But at that time, China had an estimated 320 nuclear warheads, while the US and Russia together had an estimated just over 12,000. So the Chinese came back and said, okay, if you come down to our level, 320, we'll be happy to talk to you tomorrow and participate, but we know you're never going to do that. And so today, with Trump's denuclearization proposal, which he's very interested in having something that's, again, a trilateral deal, China has already come back and said, okay, you and Russia set the example. You two have 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. You should take the lead. We should take the lead. We need to take the lead and significantly reduce your arsenals. And then we'll, to create the conditions for the rest of us who are nuclear armed to come in and join the disarmament process. So once again, the Chinese are signaling, wait a second, we're not going to jump to go along with this. So that's where my concern is that this could fall apart again, as it did in the past. So if Trump is going to insist on China's participation before the US and Russia come down to their level, that's my concern about that. I think that's the state of play with New START in terms of where we are right now.
Negotiations about, please, Governor Brown.
Well, yeah, I don't want to sound too optimistic. I certainly think I haven't so far. It is possible. Trump's been talking about his Nobel Prize. The only way he's going to get a Nobel Prize is if he brings what looks like a stable peace that's acceptable with Ukraine, and he gets something done with nuclear weaponry. And so if you look back, Obama, the New START was pretty darn good. So I want to acknowledge that. But the fact that it had to be embedded in a major expansion in the guise of modernization shows you the inertia, the inertial force for more weaponry, more nuclear is so strong. Now, Trump's coming in here and he's really throwing out everything. And it's possible he's such an independent operator, he could possibly envision some kind of an agreement with Putin. And maybe China would have something they could do. They're still going to have to build up probably in their own minds for their own prestige purposes. But I don't think it's, I think if you're waiting for the Democrats to get nuclear restraint, I don't know that there's any, that it's worse under Trump. It might even be better. Now, we don't know it's going to be better, but there's an opportunity. He's a one-man show. If he gets it in his mind that these nuclear weapons are, if you have enough of them, you don't need any more, and therefore you could do some kind of reduction, it's quite possible that he and Putin could come to an agreement if that's what Putin wants. Now, Putin wants a larger arrangement with economics and all the rest of it. So it's quite a big deal needed to get anything. And can Trump pull that off? I would say it's possible. And I'd say before we were headed in big trouble. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists each year was saying doomsday is getting closer. So we weren't on a good path. We may be on a very bad path now, but we don't know whether or not there isn't some breakthrough possible in the next few months. That's my hope.
Bill, you earlier brought up the point of this kind of institutional roadblocks on the way to disarmament. Also, the fact that the United States is set up in a federal way, right, in which lower levels, sometimes by the way that they interact with the higher level, can block decisions. Bill, what do you see? What kind of problems do you see in the way that could seriously prevent or hamper any kind of grand strategic agreement on nuclear weapons?
Well, I think a forceful president could overcome some of these obstacles. I mean, we certainly have many fewer nuclear weapons than we did at the height of the Cold War. The thing about Trump is, well, he has a great man theory of history, but he's the only great man in that theory. And he's not consistent. I mean, in his first term, he was talking to Kim Jong-un, and he was criticized for speaking to him, which I think was ridiculous. If you don't speak to your adversary, you can't come to agreement. But he didn't follow through. He was sort of tilted towards making nuclear threats. The whole thing sort of fell apart. So can he, be consistent? Can he develop the expertise around him to actually conclude an agreement? Those are big questions. And he's also very good at public relations. So if he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, he would just say it was rigged. He should have gotten it, or he'll make his own and put it on his desk, or who knows. So it's a little hard to know how he gets from point A to point B. I mean, I think the fact that he's transactional, I don't think he has a set ideology, which may be helpful, but getting him to stay on track. And of course, I think a lot of the concerns inside the U.S. are about his dismantling of democracy. And so I think for some people that overwhelms any other considerations of what he might or might not do. So, it's going to be a very kind of stressful, turbulent internal political environment, which will affect in some ways foreign policy, I do believe.
At the moment, there are these two interpretations about what's going on. One is that what Mr. Trump said during the campaign trail, that he's the peace candidate and he wants peace and he wants to extricate the United States from Europe, Middle East and Pacific, and reduce the military spending. That's one way. The other school of thought says, well, what's happening right now is that the US tries to take itself out of Europe in order to have more time to focus on China and the inevitability of a clash with China, as some of the hardcore realists would say. What's your gut feeling, everybody? Is the current administration doing this for the sake of refocusing the United States on the US, or is it doing it actually with a view on more confrontation toward China? And I don't know who wants to start. Maybe Governor Brown?
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that Elbridge Colby wants to focus on China. He wrote a book called The Strategy of Denial, How to Beat China in a War Over Taiwan, which I reviewed, by the way, for the New York Review of Books, if you want to take a look at it, because I'm very dubious of what he said. So, yeah, he's got a lot of hawks around him that are going to want to say, now let's go get China. And China's a big threat. So that's the problem. But on the other hand, he is transactional. He has expressed a concern about the danger of nuclear weapons. He has expressed a concern about these endless wars. He wants to pull back in a very 19th century kind of way, which doesn't fit the 21st century. But I don't think it's by any means certain, but it is possible. There are people that I talk to who are concerned, who know about arms control. They think it's possible that Trump will try to get some grand agreement with the Russians, with Putin. I think that fits his grandiosity. So I think that the trouble is it's all one man. There's no pressure for some big nuclear agreement coming from the Republicans, and not too much coming from the Democrats, because the interest in the nuclear danger is very minimal. I mean, you might have 8 people in the Congress, maybe a handful of senators, a handful of congressmen. Rest of them aren't concerned. They got other things they're worried about, and these other things are important. But where we are, we got a one-man show. There's a one-man show in Russia and a one-man show in the U.S. And hopefully he'll do the right thing when it comes to doing something with Russia to reduce the nuclear danger.
I will ask Cynthia in just a second to give her thoughts on this, but just a follow-up question for you, Governor Brown. How is it that today it's the Republicans who are the peace party and not the Democrats anymore? I mean, you were a Democratic governor for like twice. Why? What happened to the Democratic Party that it turned this way?
Well, when I was a young boy, I got my doctor down the street would always say, the Democrats, they always bring the wars. And he would, at that time, said World War I, Democrat Woodrow Wilson. World War II, Roosevelt. Korean War, Truman. Well, now we've had Bush, so the Democratic record has been broken. But look, the Democratic Party needs money. It needs support. Their interest groups. If you go to these fundraisers, look at these elections cost billions, and it's not only just the defense contractors and their friends, but there's a certain patriotic spirit that we want to have the biggest guns in town, and the Democrats are a prey to that. There are not a lot of peace Democrats. I mean, even Bernie is more interested in equality. And I don't want to minimize equality. That's a huge challenge for America. But the people who want to talk nuclear are very few. And so there's not a big Democratic peace movement. There used to be, but there's some. And who knows? I mean, I think we were on a bad path, no doubt. And it wasn't recognized. Doomsday clocked in. I don't think it was being taken seriously in Washington. But nevertheless, it was striking movement closer to doom. So I think we're not in a worse position. And given the willingness of Trump to break the mold and his desire to be ultimately respected in the world, he may be open to some nuclear deal, depending, of course, what Putin want. Does Putin have a sense of the danger, or does he feel pretty happy with the nuclear competition?
Cynthia, your take on this?
Well, I really want to pick up on this, on what Governor Brown said about the lack of awareness about the nuclear danger. And I want to just say that he also mentioned Bill Perry early on. And I made a film where I interviewed the top experts in the US and Russia on nuclear dangers back in 2017 and interviewed Gorbachev and Perry, among others. And those two really had the greatest impact on me because William Perry said something that really addressed this question of nuclear danger. And I think that's sort of key to getting movement on this issue, which he said, today we're at a greater risk of some sort of a nuclear catastrophe than we were during the Cold War, but most people are blissfully unaware of this danger. Because we don't understand the danger, we make no serious attempt to repair the hostility between the United States and Russia, so we're allowing ourselves to sleepwalk into another catastrophe. We must wake up. And I think it's this sleepwalking. People back, I came of age during the Cold War and in the 1980s, and was involved in this work back then. And it was that fear of nuclear war, the understanding, the concern, that the sort of large scale movement of people of all ages and backgrounds that feared nuclear war and wanted to see the world come to some different agreement, which happened remarkably between Reagan and Gorbachev, which no one ever would have dreamed possible when Reagan came to power, because he came to power on peace through strength. And it was embarked on the largest nuclear arms buildup in history before that time. and it was the evil empire, and it was a very scary time. So I think that this element of sleepwalking has to be addressed somehow. And, you know, and I want to come back to a resolution that was passed in the fall at the UN to set up a scientific panel to produce a report examining the consequences of nuclear war. And I think when you wake up people to those consequences, and you talk about nuclear winter and things like that, and people understand what those are, you have a better appreciation of what's going on. In any case, with that resolution, 144 countries voted in favor, 3 against. One of those was Russia, and 30 abstained, and China and the US abstained. So it's really, I think that we need to create a movement to get that information out there, because from the bottom up as well as from the top down, this can be pushed through and address the economic interests that are fighting against this kind of that Bill referenced, you know, that have kept us or have played a huge role. The ICBM lobby, the military industrial complex have played a huge role in keeping us where we are. The lobbies in Washington, in the Congress, impacting the Congress. So I think I have hope. I have a lot of hope, Governor Brown and Bill and Pascal, that we actually do have a chance now to try to do something. That even though there are obstacles, and even though there's this issue of if China has to be brought in, that's a concern for me, then the deal might fall apart. But I do think that and Putin has said that he's interested. You know, he's interested in having the conversation. So I think that we have a chance.
And there is also worldwide momentum for this. Let's not forget, we have the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in the UN, which is in force, and it has more than 50 state parties to it. So there's a large group of countries in the world that would like to prohibit nuclear weapons altogether and get rid of them. Now, this is probably not going to happen. We know that the big 5 who have them and the other 4 who have them illegally, they don't want that. But Bill, do you think that that there is reason for hope, for momentum toward maybe not outlawing a nuclear weapon altogether, but getting a new framework to which the US, Russia, and China under which they might maybe even reduce, if not cap, their nuclear warheads?
Well, I'm in favor of hope, and I think, yeah, I agree with Cynthia. We've made extraordinary strides at certain moments in history, like in the 80s. And there was the fear, but there was also some organization, something people could do with their fear, like the Freeze Campaign, European Nuclear Disarmament Movement. I think those two together it was what turned things around. Actually, by Reagan's second run for office, some of his bureaucrats were saying, well, you know, this is a big deal, Mr. President. This isn't just a bunch of peaceniks. This is the mainline churches. This is a movement that could cost you politically. He came out kind of double-barreled. You know, one was, well, Star Wars will protect you, but the other was he did actually start thinking about nuclear reductions. So, you know, to have a president who was joking about the bombing starting in 5 minutes, ending up with nuclear reductions, even talking about nuclear elimination altogether, was just an example of if people focus, we can make a lot of headway quickly. I think one of the problems now is there's multiple threats. There's climate, there's pandemics. I think also just the general kind of people feeling they don't have a grip on their lives or an ability to change sort of anything the government does. So I think there has to be a reminder to people that we've made amazing progress in the past against difficult odds, and also that kind of we have to get past the individualism that says, well, nothing I do is going to matter. Well, no, it's people in the millions that matter, but every one of them has to make that commitment to do something. So it's almost like a retraining of ourselves to be more active citizens. And some people, I think, you know, that it's almost like when you express hope, you're dismissed as naive, you know. But what is naive is to keep these things around and assume they're not going to be used again. So the hawks are the naive ones, and we should point that out, I think.
Cynthia,
Well,
you look like you want.
Well, I want to pick up on the Treaty on the Prohibition for Nuclear Weapons because it's one of those things that, when I first heard about it in the nuclear security community, they said it's never going to happen. It's never going to happen, this treaty. And then when it happened in 2017, and it was passed at the UN and adopted by over 122 countries, it passed. People said it's never going to be ratified. And then it's never going to enter into force. It's never going to enter into force. And then it did. And I just want to, and I'm actually, my organization, Women Transforming Our Nuclear Legacy, we're partners, and I'm proud to be a partner of ICANN. And really, the treaty is the greatest ray of light and hope for me and keeps me going in this work. 73 states have ratified the treaty, and 94 have signed it. And so it's getting more signatories. So it does set a standard. It sets a taboo, and it stigmatizes the use of nuclear weapons. And one of the ways that it got standing at the UN, it was built on a series of conferences that really looked at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, which comes back to that idea of just needing to wake up from the sleepwalking and if people to understand what's at stake.
Governor.
Yeah, and I think also the big powers tried to say, oh, we're doing this for the world. We're building stability for the world. And the rest of the world just says, no, we don't want that. And so I think that's a huge step forward, even though, of course, we haven't gotten the big powers to disarm, but that's going to take work internally in those countries as well as this international norm. But, a lot of arms controllers in Washington kind of dismissed the whole idea of the nuclear ban treaty until it came into force, at which point they made it sound like they had supported it all along. So there's, everybody loves a winner. But it would be nice if they had supported it, along the way.
Governor Brown?
Well, I think things can change. Like a kaleidoscope, it can shift a little bit and the pattern shifts. It wasn't that long ago that Kissinger, Schultz, Perry, and Nunn wrote a series of articles calling for, well, I don't know, it was a 100% abolition, but it was the movement toward abolishing nuclear weapons. And it was serious. And there was hope. I've talked to Bill Perry in the last few months. He was very hopeful at that point. And then it just dissipates. So there's movements in history that are mysterious. But the fact that there's a ban treaty reflects a very strong global sentiment against nuclear. And the fact that you had Schultz and Nunn and the other two, this shows you people can understand that nuclear weaponry is irrational. They didn't understand in the beginning, but it's getting to be understood. And in fact, it's understood, I think, by Russia and the U.S. and China. That's why they voted either to abstain or against the idea of studying what are the nuclear consequences. What kind of a rational mind says, I don't want to know about the consequences. Please don't tell me. Well, that is a fear. There's something here. This is a horror. And if this commission can make that horror more evident, we can make some progress. The fact is, the fact that nuclear is kept quiet, it's kept in a little black box for the experts, and 99.99% of the people get no information, no exposure, no feeling about the nuclear danger. But they can. And so ICANN is moving the global constituency, the study of the consequences, and now Nuclear Winter is getting a second review. And right now, I think the science is very clear that they're not sure. They're not as there was more confidence 30 years ago. Oh wow, you're gonna have nuclear winter. Well, then that was people undermined that and said, well, you can't prove it. They came up with a few objections, but later studies show this is plausible. It's nothing certain in life, but if it's plausible that you could lose billions, then what the hell are you doing? I mean, so there's only one way to handle that. don't think about it. So it's very rational to stop any understanding of the consequences of nuclear war. But that's something we can work on. Just rub that in people's face. This is a horror, and do something about it. And more of that sentiment can be engendered. And who knows, maybe it can even move Putin and Trump. They have some rationality. And this is not irrational. The nuclear game is like there's some spell cast over humanity. It makes no sense. And yet they're spending tens of billions every year on it.
Yep. And the point is, this is the one thing that I think everybody can agree, whether you're Chinese, Russian, American, Ghanaian, Tanzanian, Malaysian, or Japanese, we all like being alive. I mean, it's kind of we are not that suicidal as a species. So question is how to get to a virtuous track where we don't accidentally, this 8 billion planet that we are, where we accidentally blow ourselves up. We are nearing the 90-minute mark. I would like to give everybody a 1-minute last comments on what you've heard and what you've discussed, what you think is important. We start with Governor Brown, then go to Bill, and Cynthia gets the last word. Governor Brown.
Well, I'd say that clear voices are needed more than ever. The cacophony coming out of Washington, the whole disinformation and confusion of what we're reading about, it makes everything more difficult. That's why you got to keep it simple. And it's very simple to state that nuclear danger is real and it's not in anybody's interest. And so let's do something about it. And I think Trump, I don't say it's certain, but it's possible that he and Putin could come up with something. I just wish that more people in the Congress could say something, do something. Stimulating other people, whether it's the churches, the university presidents, or senators or Congress people, they ought to be talking about the nuclear danger and incorporating that into the larger settlement between the U.S. and Russia.
Thank you. Bill.
Well, I think we have to act out of hope instead of fear. We have to put aside the indifference that says we can't change things. And it's not like the great powers have to be best of friends. If you acknowledge that this threat threatens all of us, they could compete in other areas and still try to take care of this. But we have not gotten to that point yet. But I think a lot of people either don't understand the nuclear danger or think it's theoretical compared to the things that are right in front of them. So somehow we have to change that consciousness,
I agree. And Cynthia, last words go to you.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I want to say that I think that for me, I went through the Hawaii false alarm in 2018, and I got the text message that we all did in Hawaii, over 1 million of us, that ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii, seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. That was a life-changing experience for me. I'd just been awakened by Gorbachev and Bill Perry and everybody else in the interviewing them. But to go through and to actually have the experience of thinking you're going to be hit by a nuclear missile made it real for me in a way that'll never go away until we get rid of nuclear weapons. Hollywood played a huge role in the 1980s in terms of waking people up. So I think that there are ways to wake people up. I wouldn't want anyone to have to go through what I went through to wake up, because I spent those 38 minutes racing to shelter and trying to prepare my family to survive the nuclear attack. But I think that we can find creative ways to wake people up, and that is going to really, that would make a difference if we had that on those conditions happening all over the world again, and then the leaders rising to the occasion, and to end on the note of hope that we can do this again. If we did it back then, we can do it now, even though it's a different time.
Wise words, and we've got to get real about nuclear weapons, about how afraid we should be of them. I would like to thank all of you for your wonderful contributions and your analysis, and I would like to thank Katrina van den Heuvel and the Acura, the organization that brought us together to discuss this. We will stay on the topic, and thanks from my part, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Pascal.
Thank you very much. Very important.